In one of the most notorious scandals in British commercial airliner history, the BAC 211 and 311 were a pair of promising schemes developed to combat the likes of the Boeing 727 and the proposed Airbus A300, the intentions of which were to maintain Britain's place on the world stage for independently built civil aircraft, but due to the prioritisation of international relations and policies, combined with the bleak outlooks of a government rife with defeatism during a period known as managed decline, this endearing duo would remain forever on the drawing board, and today have become the harbinger for the UK's wider retreat from its once commanding position in the global aviation industry. To understand the BAC 211 and 311, one must first consider the situation the British aircraft industry was in at the time of their conception, the UK, coming out of World War II, being one of the key players in commercial airliner design, and had all the momentum for seeing a massive resurgence thanks to extensive production facilities used during wartime to build fighters and bombers to combat the threat of Nazi Germany, this being combined with an incredibly forward-thinking initiative known as the Brabazon Committee, which had been established in 1942 when the outcome of the war was still very much uncertain, the expectation being that, come peacetime, Great Britain would retain market dominance through technological barnstormers that integrated mechanics and design characteristics developed during the conflict, including jet and turbine propulsion, radar, pressurized airframes and more. However, while the Brabazon Committee had all the promise necessary to ensure Britain's retained status on the global market, the results were largely a series of either failures or never realised ambitions, caused primarily by internal competition between the various manufacturers called in to provide designs, or simply because the proposals had no business case due to their specifications. The eponymous Bristol Brabazon, a gargantuan transatlantic airliner with 8 paired contra-rotating propellers, that was essentially a flying ocean liner with on-board sleeping accommodation, an a la carte restaurant and even a 37-seat cinema, going no further than a single flying prototype due to delays in developing its Proteus engine and an extreme lack of commercial interest based squarely around its exceptionally poor cost-to-benefit ratio. A similar case being observed for the smaller Armstrong-Whitworth AW55 Apollo, where, due to the builder refusing to utilise a more appropriate power plant, the underpowered Mamba turboprop engines were barely able to get the empty AW55 off the ground, thus leading to no interest by potential customers, while those models that did make it to production were dogged with similar sales impotence, as was the case with the Airspeed Ambassador, a small piston-powered feeder liner that was rendered obsolete by its stablemate, the Vickers Viscount, the Avro 690, a transatlantic turboprop that, following multiple delays, wouldn't enter service until 1957 as the now severely outdated Bristol Britannia, and the Miles Marathon, a small transport aircraft that was disrupted partway through development by the collapse of its builder, followed by its main customer refusing to take on the type when it did eventually reach fruition. In the end, out of 9 proposals, only 3 saw at least a modicum of success. The Vickers Viscount, the world's first turboprop airliner that sold in huge numbers across the globe, the de Havilland Dove, a short-haul regional aircraft that would go on to become the best-selling British commercial airliner in history, and, most prominently, the de Havilland Comet, the pioneer of the jet age, which, upon its maiden flight in 1948, illustrated that Britain led the way when it came to innovation in the field of civil aviation, only for the dream of the Comet to be dashed, following several fatal crashes during 1954, caused by the largely unknown phenomenon of metal fatigue, a loss of confidence in the model, together with the British investigation team sharing their findings with the aircraft manufacturers of America, France and the Soviet Union, meaning that when the revised Comet 4 was launched in 1958 with its problems amended, it had been swamped by a sea of new metal being produced by the industrial powerhouse of the United States, the results of which were Britain being pushed firmly into second place, as the likes of the Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8 swept out of their Renton and Long Beach factories to conquer the global market. The fundamental problems of the British airliner industry of the 1950s, despite holding all the innovation cards and being years ahead of its international rivals, was a largely myopic view by the government when it came to the position the UK would be in as a global power in the decades to come, and the stringent demands of the UK's 2 state-owned national carriers, the British Overseas Airways Corporation or BOAC, which operated international services and routes to the British Empire, and British European Airways or BEA, which was tasked with working domestic and European runs. BOAC and BEA, holding an essential monopoly on the British airline market, being given incredible amounts of influence over the design of commercial airliners that could conceivably be used in their fleet, perhaps the finest testament to this being when, in 1954, Vickers, intending to regain the ground lost by the Comet disasters, developed from their V1000 military transport aircraft concept a proposed passenger variant dubbed the VC-7, which, like the V1000, would be based on the general airframe and wing design of the Vickers Valiant nuclear bomber, but with an enlarged fuselage so as to carry up to 150 passengers. While the V-1000 project was axed in mid-1954, when the Ministry of Defence opted instead to utilise military transport variants of the upcoming Bristol Britannia, Vickers continued to persevere with the VC-7, and by the autumn of 1955 had completed 80% of the first prototype, with a view to seeing it undertake its first flight during the summer of 1956, 2 years ahead of the Boeing 707 and 4 years ahead of the Douglas DC-8, meaning Britain would have held a vital time advantage over its American rivals, only for BOAC to completely disown the project, based on a mixture of their fervent desire to increase their prestige through the use of American-built models, and a lack of confidence in British designs following the Comet crashes, stating publicly that their abandonment of the VC-7 was primarily due to the fact that no commercial jet engine existed that would be able to efficiently power the proposed airliner, thus leading, in November 1955, to the overall scheme being cancelled, a move that high-ranking figures in the British aviation industry noted as being the point where the UK essentially surrendered both its lead and its future position on the global aviation market to its rivals. For the remainder of the 1950s, the British government attempted to ensure that the UK airliner industry remained relevant by forcing BOAC and BEA to buy locally sourced models whenever possible through what was known as launch aid, wherein the government would subsidise the losses being made by BEA and BOAC on buying a British-built airliner in the event its operational costs proved to be higher than an equivalent model built in either America or continental Europe, a not-so-subtle hint that carriers like BEA were barred from purchasing the pioneering Sud Aviation Caravelle regional jet of France, and thus being forced to make do with the enlarged Vickers Vanguard turboprop, a sturdy design, but one that appeared far too late to be a commercial success due to the presence of the much faster Caravelle within its market segment, while at the same time, the influence of the two national carriers continued to dictate the design process of future British jet airliner models to the point that it completely crippled their sales viability, two of the most egregious examples being the Hawker Siddeley Trident and the Vickers VC-10. The Hawker Siddeley Trident was originally based on a de Havilland concept for a 111-seat three-engine jet airliner that would integrate into its design many highly innovative avionics systems, including the world's first automatic landing systems, which are now an industry standard for zero-visibility flying, and would have been launched as early as 1960 as a model that was larger than the Caravelle, and was years ahead of Boeing's proposed rival, the upcoming 727 of 1963, only for the sudden but brief downturn in passenger traffic following the Eisenhower recession of 1958 to give BEA cold feet, and therefore demand that the Trident be shrunk to a 103-seat capacity, with Hawker Siddeley obliging against their own better judgment, which, in combination with the Hatfield design team giving away nearly all their vital information to Boeing, in what they had hoped would be a possible partnership to create an optimized trijet for both the United States and Europe, meant when the Trident did eventually enter sales in 1962, it was far too small to be of any interest to potential buyers, while the Boeing 727 that followed had integrated many of the advanced design features of the British trijet so as to improve its own overall design, Hawker Siddeley spending the remainder of its production run attempting to increase the size of the airliner to make it competitive again, only to find the entire marketplace was now saturated with Boeing's superb new model. The VC-10, on the other hand, rose from the ashes of the failed VC-7 and had many strong and endearing features that, in many ways, outstripped the Boeing 707, including a quadruplicated autopilot and a cutting-edge wing design which, in combination with its 4 incredibly powerful Rolls-Royce Conway engines positioned at the rear, meant this stylish airliner could operate out of hot and high airports such as Nairobi and Singapore, where due to the heat and low air density, models such as the Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8 would struggle to reach their rotation speed when taking off, as their engines would be down on power, the specific needs of the VC-10 being based squarely on BOAC's extensive Empire routes to the British colonies, which, together with its clean wing and sleek T-tail configuration, created an airliner that was adored by passengers and crew alike, and is often considered one of the most beautiful jet aircraft ever built to fly. Sadly, problems emerged in that the VC-10 was an exceptionally expensive aircraft to maintain and operate, its complex avionics meaning that routine servicing took twice as long as the comparative Boeing 707, while at the same time, due to the collapse of the British Empire in the late 1950s and early 1960s, many of the former colonial routes were severed, which, together with other hot and high airports having their runways extended to accommodate 707s and DC-8s, meant that the VC-10 was rapidly left without a market to serve, BOAC, based on these factors, refusing outright to take on the VC-10 due to its threadbare business case, only for strong-arming by the government to lead them initially to negotiate that BAC would cover the necessary break-even of the project for 80 units, until eventually settling on a minimum fleet of 25 units, in exchange for the carrier being allowed to take on a clutch of additional Boeing 707-420s fitted with Rolls-Royce Conway low-bypass turbofans, a crippling prospect that caused the collapse of the VC-10 scheme after only 54 units. In combination with models that weren't selling, the British aircraft industry itself was being downsized dramatically at the insistence of the government, who desired as fewer aircraft manufacturers and engine providers as possible so as to streamline the development process of models and cut down expenditure. These problems compounded further in 1957 by the publishing of a defence white paper, as penned by the recently appointed Minister of Defence Duncan Sandys, which demanded that nearly every military contract for manned fighter and bomber projects be dropped, due to budgetary constraints and the rise of ballistic missiles to replace conventional aircraft in tactical situations, the outcome of which stripped many of Britain's aviation builders of work and led, in most cases, to their financial collapse, requiring amalgamations and mergers in order to survive. One such merger, as encouraged by Parliament, being the combination of 4 large British corporations into a single conglomerate known as the British Aircraft Corporation, or BAC, which encompassed the former assets of English Electric Aviation Limited, the Vickers Armstrong Aircraft Division, the Bristol Aeroplane Company, and Hunting Aircraft. At the time of the merger, 3 of these builders were in direct competition with each other to develop a regional jet airliner that would take on the likes of the Sud Aviation Carvel and the upcoming Douglas DC-9 of America, these being the Hunting 107, the Bristol Type 200, and the Vickers VC-11, which, despite not having the same prestige of the long-haul VC-10, had much greater market promise as this particular segment was still largely untapped, and therefore the domain of 1940s-era piston-powered aircraft, with the Hunting 107 being of particular note, as through market research, it had been precisely optimized for the requirements of what the wider aviation scene was seeking in a short to medium-range jet airliner, rather than what was being demanded by either BOAC or BEA, and following its ability to illustrate far greater merits than the Bristol or Vickers proposals, eventually made its first flight in 1963 as the redesignated BAC 111, taking to the skies a year prior to the Douglas DC-9 and seeing huge sales interest from across the globe, including the highly demanding and extremely insular North American market, which even led to a major scandal when the United States government, through its aviation branch, the Civil Aeronautics Board, directly intervened as to ensuring that American carriers didn't buy the British jet, resulting in the federal government being accused of protectionism, as the arbitrary restrictions imposed on those carriers ordering the 111 were not forced upon carriers that bought the equivalent Boeing 727 or Douglas DC-9. However, the BAC 111, while being remembered as among Britain's most successful passenger airliners, unfortunately had many problems which relegated what could have been a great airliner into merely a good one, the first being the crash of its first prototype, Golf Alpha Sierra Hotel Golf, on October 22, 1963, when it was found that due to the aircraft entering a stable stalled condition that was impossible to recover from, as the wings blocked the airflow over the elevators on the T-tail, a subsequent study attributed this phenomenon to deep stall, a situation that is largely unique to T-tail airliners such as the BAC 111 and the larger Trident, the time taken for BAC's engineers to determine the cause of the accident being of such length that it pushed service entry for the type back to 1965, allowing the Douglas DC-9 to close the gap, with impatient or wary customers choosing to drop their orders for the 111 in favour of the more stable development of the DC-9, while due to the limitations of the Rolls-Royce Spey turbofan engines equipped originally to the model, BAC were reluctant to extend the length of the fuselage to increase capacity until a more powerful engine had been developed, while at the same time being barred from purchasing the tried-and-tested Pratt & Whitney JT8D engine of America, as used on the Douglas DC-9, due to the British government's launch aid restrictions, meaning the BAC 111 remained in its original guise with a capacity of 89 seats until the launch of the 111-500 with 199 seats from mid-1967, 6 months after the launch of the lengthened Douglas DC-9 Series 30, which swept up a large portion of the market, the BAC 111 eventually selling only 244 units by the time production ended in 1989, while 976 DC-9s were produced and saw work with nearly every major airline in the world. Nevertheless, though the situation for the British aircraft industry was somewhat dire by the middle of the 1960s, it was not completely irredeemable, as when compared to other European nations, the UK hosted by far the largest and most experienced commercial aircraft business, with France, aside from its huge sales success with the Sud Aviation Carvel, developing models that were largely restricted to only a few carriers within the Gallic sphere of influence such as Belgium, Algeria, and other French colonies, while West Germany, due to post-war restrictions imposed by the Allied forces, was not allowed to undertake independent aircraft development until this ban was lifted in 1955, after which the nation pursued various military and commercial proposals through a corporate amalgamation of former German aircraft builders and manufacturing firms known as VFW, or Vereinte Flugtechnische Werke, the aircraft industries of Europe seeing early on that in order to help bring their projects to fruition, technical and design input should be sought from the British, as was the case with the pioneering Caravelle, which took on Rolls-Royce engines and even adopted the nose and cockpit layout of the de Havilland Comet, cooperative systems within Europe being encouraged further by the creation of the European Economic Community, or EEC, during the 1950s, allowing for the easier movement of people, industries and finance across the continent and thereby encouraging economic recovery in the post-war years. With the formation of the EEC, Britain was incredibly eager to join in so as to benefit from this new connectivity between the nations of Europe, but was humiliated upon its attempted application during 1963 and 1967 when French President Charles de Gaulle, who held a strong influence over the largely French-led EEC concept, refused to accept the entry of the UK into the common market due to his fear that the nation would demand its own conditions that directly contravened those of the wider European community. The opinion of the newly elected Labour government of Harold Wilson in 1964 being that Britain should do whatever was necessary to appease the states of Europe, in showing the country's willingness to cooperate as part of international joint ventures so as to combat the incredible influence of the United States. And with commercial airliners now essentially being the ambassadors of Britain's technological prowess on the world stage, he turned his attention to the possibility of the UK's aviation industry being focused more intently on developing future aircraft models in collaboration with equivalent European builders. The result was the publishing of the Plowden Report during 1965, which stated in no uncertain terms that the British aircraft industry had no viable commercial future, despite the fact that it was by far the largest and most advanced in Europe, and that any forthcoming project should be developed in conjunction with international partners, a statement that was received with discontent across the industry as being an overarchingly defeatist attitude, and one which the aviation industries of Europe and America would never publicly state for fear of sacrificing the prestige of their aircraft builders, this being coupled with the abandonment of several promising military and civilian projects during the same year, the most notable of which was the BAC TSR-2, a highly advanced strike and reconnaissance aircraft that was axed as it neared completion during the same year at a cost of £250 million, while pre-existing concepts, such as the desire of both France and Britain to create a supersonic transport that had spawned during the 1950s, were amalgamated into what would eventually result in the exceptionally innovative though commercially disastrous BAC Aerospatiale Concorde of the 1970s. Concorde, however, was yet again another instance of the British government's willingness to sacrifice the more prevalent aspects of the design to the French in order to smooth over the UK's potential entry into the common market, as following the agreement to combine the British and French studies into a single project during November 1962, the details of this accord required that Bristol Aircraft, who had developed a superbly advanced airframe for their SST proposal, hand over 60% of its design to Sud Aviation for completion, with Bristol only retaining 40% of this work, while in exchange the French jet engine builder, Snecma, would grant Rolls-Royce, who had recently acquired the Bristol Siddeley Engine Company, 60% of the development work for the Olympus turbojet engines that would power the Concorde, while Snecma would handle 40% of the engine design work. This handing over of designs essentially meaning the French aviation industry, which was years behind Britain in developing a supersonic airliner, was given a near fully developed airframe and allowed to close the substantial gap between the UK and French design teams, in contrast to Rolls-Royce gaining very little from Snecma, as a majority of the engine design work had been undertaken by Bristol and thus required no significant input from the French side to bring to fruition. This, in combination with the Concorde project now being based primarily at the Sud Aviation factory in Toulouse, and setting a precedent for future collaborative efforts between the UK and France for projects such as the Sepcat Jaguar, where Britain would willingly sacrifice project leadership to France, meaning the overarching result of the Concorde project was that Britain lost more in its independent development of cutting-edge supersonic transports than it gained from its French counterparts. Outside the realm of Concorde, as the aviation industry of America grew exponentially following its highly successful entry into the jet age with such marvels as the Boeing 707 and 727, together with the Douglas DC-8 and DC-9, it became rapidly evident to their European rivals that, with a combined market-led powerhouse like America spreading its influence across the globe, any attempt to combat the US industry as individual nations or even aircraft manufacturers would be fruitless, and the airliner industries of Europe would eventually be swallowed up completely, the solution being to combine the assets of Europe's various aircraft builders in order to create a collaborative effort known as Airbus, with its first project being to tap into a prospective market for wide-body airliners, the trendsetter of which was Boeing's proposed 747 double-deck airliner that was based on the principles of a failed contract to supply the US Air Force with a wide-body transport aircraft. Enthusiasm for such a gigantic model being so great that numerous rivals soon cropped up to take on Boeing's Colossus, including two trijet models from the United States, which resulted in the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar and Douglas DC-10 of the early 1970s, and even proposals from Great Britain as it continued to cling on to its ever-dwindling place in the market. BAC announcing in 1965 that, despite a lengthened Super VC-10 already existing, the company would deliver for 1969 a double-deck Super VC-10 concept, officially designated the Vickers Type 1180, being capable of carrying 295 passengers with full economy seating, but would also lend itself to either a combi configuration or a full cargo layout, the double-deck Super VC-10 concept ultimately never going beyond the drawing board, as BOAC, who had ordered a clutch of Boeing 747s, refused to show any interest in any derivatives of the VC-10. Airbus, as established in September 1967, would merge the design teams of the British, French and West German airliner industries through the collaboration of Hawker Siddeley, Sudaviation and Arbeitsgemeinschaft Airbus or ARGA Airbus, the latter of which was a consortium of Germany's 7 airframe manufacturers, but again proved the eagerness of the British government to deliver without consideration any and all design leadership to the foreign industries of France and Germany, despite the fact that the UK held the strongest position of them all in terms of pre-existing airliner models built and sold, the Airbus project being no exception, as in exchange for France taking overall charge of the project, handing over to Sudaviation Hawker Siddeley's own independently developed and incredibly sophisticated twin-jet wide-body airliner design, known as the HBN 100, the UK would take the position of junior partner by having Hawker Siddeley create the wing layout, the only design aspect of the HBN 100 retained, while Rolls-Royce would be given the role of exclusive engine provider for the Airbus project with the RB207, a scaled-down version of the upcoming RB211 powerplant, being assembled for the American Lockheed TriStar. The problem was that, in order to support the Airbus project, the British government was willing to abandon any comparative developments being independently piloted in the UK so as to focus as much money and political will into the European joint venture project, the first example of this short-sightedness being with the BAC 211, a model that was initially developed as a 200 to 250-seat twin-jet airliner in conjunction with Sudaviation following the start of their own project dubbed Galleon, which would later form the foundations of the Airbus project in the late 1960s. Although soon after work had begun, the French and British builders parted ways over the exact size of the aircraft, leading BAC to develop its own concept dubbed the 211, which was officially launched in 1966 under a requirement by BEA for a larger aircraft aimed at replacing its short-haul fleet, the British domestic carrier having originally desired the purchase of 35 Boeing 727s and 737s to take over from its Viscounts, Vanguards and Comets, though this was barred by the UK Board of Trade due to it being a major US dollar purchase that would upset the British balance of payment, demanding instead that BEA buy locally, the BAC 211 being designed around two rear-mounted Rolls-Royce RB211 engines producing £30,000 thrust each, while the airframe would be able to accommodate between 192 and 208 passengers in 6 abreast seating, and for cost saving would incorporate as many features as possible from the preceding BAC 111, including the cockpit, wing and tail surfaces, while the flight deck was carried over from the BAC 111-500. At a cost of around £100 million, of which 50% would be spent on the airframe and 50% on the engine development, BEA provided the project with enthusiastic backing, stating publicly that the BAC 211 was a far better and more efficient proposition than the Boeing 727 for the short to medium haul market, as well as signing a letter of intent in which the carrier placed a firm order for 30 units and an option for 10 additional examples, other interested parties being Laker Airways and Ortair, who also signed letters of intent for taking on small batches of the airliner. The Board of Trade also supporting the project, which was expected to undertake its first flight by the autumn of 1970, with a view to entering service from mid-1972. BAC expecting that, based on the commercial performance of the 111, that the 211 had the potential to occupy at least 20% of the market segment for short to medium haul airliners, the only thing stopping the builder from commencing detailed design work on the 211 being the need for state funding in order to bring the project to fruition, as much of BAC's own cash flow had been tied up with the BAC 111-500 scheme, although risk-sharing partners were explored, including the potential for Sudaviation to take on the role of junior partner with 35% of the aircraft value, together with Short of Northern Ireland, Fokker of the Netherlands, and Air Italia of Italy. Sadly, the timing of the BAC 211 coincided with the start of the Airbus scheme in September 1967, and with the government of Harold Wilson continuing to follow its fervent desire to join the European community, on December 15th of the same year, Parliament announced that it would not provide state funding for the 211 project, as they believed there was an insufficient market for such an airliner, and felt the development of an independent British model went against the doctrine of the Plowden Report's recommendations for international joint ventures, the 211 being seen as a huge step backwards, despite the fact that BAC had signed on multiple European partners to which they would outsource some of the design and construction work, the government's dismissal of the BAC 211 being met with harsh criticism from BEA, who declared that the airliner had huge market potential thanks to its greater capacity but equal performance to the Boeing 727, essentially filling the role of what would later become the Boeing 757, 15 years before that model ever took its first flight, BEA considering that the BAC 211 was perhaps the finest aircraft ever developed in Britain, but due to it not towing the party line in terms of satisfying French interests, was unceremoniously put out to pasture, an indication that the British airline would have to simply make do with second best rather than the very best. This pessimistic mindset would be carried over to another promising scheme being developed by Hawker Siddeley in competition with the BAC 211, where, in an attempt to replace the still struggling Trident, the company launched a study in 1966 as to comprehensively altering the design of the model to create a twin-jet version of the airframe dubbed the HS-134, which would have two Rolls-Royce RB178 high-bypass turbofan engines mounted beneath the wings in pods, while the T-tail would be replaced by a conventional fin, creating a model that was generally of similar proportions to that of the aforementioned Boeing 757, the HS-134 being capable of carrying 210 passengers and would be configured for the short to medium range market, ideally suited for the emerging holiday service to destinations further afield, such as the Canary Islands, Cyprus and North Africa. One of the more innovative aspects of the HS-134 being the creation of supercritical airfoils and a robust wing structure that could suitably carry the weight of heavier pod-mounted engines, principles which would eventually be carried over by Hawker Siddeley onto the Airbus scheme, although for the HS-134, regardless of its forward-thinking approach that was decades ahead of its time, the government once again refused to back the independent development of a brand new model, instead forcing BEA to adopt third best in the form of the slightly modified Trident III, a stretched 180-seat version of the Trident not built to be a commercial success, but simply to satisfy BEA's demands on the short to medium haul market, the only other interested party being a surprise clutch of 2 units to CAAC of Communist China. Of course, the most egregious example of Britain's fervent and unmitigated desire to support the Airbus project was the BAC 311, which was developed in response to BEA's continued requirement for a 200 to 250-seat airliner that would work short-haul services on primary routes between London and European capitals such as Paris and Amsterdam, BEA forecasting that its existing clutch of Tridents and Vanguards working this route would be unable to meet capacity demands by as early as 1973, a situation not unique to BEA, as Air France and Lufthansa also noted similar requirements on their own pan-European trunk routes, the cancellation of the BAC 211 leading directly to the start of the BAC 311 in December 1967, as the company were fully aware that, from the project's conception, BEA had no interest in purchasing the Airbus, as it was too large for their needs. Initial design work for the BAC 311 beginning in May 1968, followed by general technical specifications being outlined during the summer of that year, the general configuration of the 311 being similar to the 211 in that it would adopt twin rear-mounted Rolls-Royce RB211 engines, the adoption of which presented many distinct advantages over tri-jets and wing-mounted engines in that it gave rise to superior crosswind landing capabilities, better directional control, negligible trim changes, lower instances of debris ingestion or bird strikes, and allowed for a generally lower aircraft profile that was comparable with existing hangar and maintenance facilities. With a generously wide fuselage of 19 foot 9 inches, which was 1 foot wider than the Airbus but identical to the Douglas DC-10 and Lockheed TriStar, the 311 had the potential to accommodate 8 to 9 abreast seating, and through a market-led strategy conducted in consultation with airlines across the world, the finalized product was presented in model form at the 1970 Farnborough Air Show, the aircraft calling upon BAC's wealth of experience when it came to advanced technical and design aspects through its incorporation of incredibly innovative elements such as powered ailerons, powerful wide-chord Fowler flaps and full-span hydraulically operated leading-edge slats, which improved low-speed control and provided excellent takeoff performance, as well as proposing, for the first time in the history of commercial jet airliners, two-crew operation, replacing the flight engineer's position with the latest automatic flight control systems that were suitable for Cat 3A operation, and would have adopted a heads-up display in combination with a pioneering glass cockpit, wherein valves and dials were superseded by cutting-edge CRT monitors that could toggle various displays as to the aircraft's operation, while once again, as per the Vickers VC-10 and Hawker Siddeley Trident, the 311 would adopt the very latest in avionics technology as developed by Smiths Aerospace of Cincinnati, Ohio. Following a full technical audit of the 311 project, as conducted by the British government in 1969, it was found that the direct operating cost, or DOC, of the scheme was 8.5% more favourable than the Airbus A300, while the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, who had undertaken initial performance assessments of the proposed model, considered that it was a well-balanced design that, thanks to its clean wing, presented takeoff and landing performance that far exceeded its European rival. BAC envisaging that the 311 would cater for three distinct market categories: high-density European scheduled services, in which it would carry 245 passengers in single-class configuration, European high-density tourist services with a capacity of 300 passengers, and trunk route operations across the continental United States, accommodating 36 first-class and 168 coach-class seats. Though the flexibility of the fuselage meant it could easily be tailored to other markets, such as Latin America, Australia, and the emerging Far Eastern network, BAC's marketing team going globe-trotting to try and drum up commercial support for the project, with potential customers encompassing 40 individual clients, ranging from European flag carriers to American trunk airlines such as Delta, Continental and United, to key Asian and Australian companies such as Japan Airlines, All Nippon, Ansett, Air India, and Trans-Australia Airlines. The order book for the 311, by the end of 1969, eventually coming to 43 firm orders, 20 of which were commitments from BEA as the launch customer, while the remainder were a peppering of 3 to 4 units, as ordered by the likes of Laker Airways, Britannia Airways and Courtline of the UK, Pan International and Bavaria Flug of West Germany, Austral of Argentina, and a surprise order from behind the Iron Curtain in the form of Romanian flag carrier Tarom. This figure continued to grow into 1970, with that year seeing tentative options for the BAC 311 reaching 179 units from carriers all over the world, including Eastern, American and Mohawk Airlines of the United States, JAT Yugoslavia, Irish flag carrier Aer Lingus, South African Airways, Belgian flag carrier Sabena, and LOT Polish Airlines. While by comparison the Airbus A300 had only 6 firm orders with 10 options made by Air France as merely a gesture of national support, meaning that, by the turn of the new decade, the BAC 311 was leaps and bounds ahead of the Airbus in terms of commercial performance, but not the same could be said for its physical development, as a matter of funding still needed to be ironed out, as BAC estimated the 311 scheme would cost £150 million, together with a further £25 to £30 million investment in new production facilities at the Weybridge factory in Surrey, plus another £60 million to help bring the Rolls-Royce RB211 power plant, which was running far behind schedule and way over budget, through to fruition. Although as confidence in Rolls-Royce's ability to deliver the RB211, as well as the smaller RB207, began to wane as it became clear the company was heading straight for bankruptcy, the BAC 311 was made available for the possibility of adopting American-built General Electric CF6 power units as an alternative in the same manner as the Airbus A300 had. The latter move causing the British government to revoke its stake in the Airbus project during 1969, leaving the only UK involvement in the European international scheme as Hawker Siddeley's provision of wings for the A300 as a private supplier. Once again, the government of Harold Wilson was not keen on the idea of an independently developed British airliner, and thus dragged their feet when it came to supplying the necessary launch aid so as to allow for full-scale development of the BAC 311 to commence, regardless of the fact that, as with the BAC 211, the 311 called upon international collaboration that was centred in Britain, with suppliers in Europe, Japan, the United States, and even the communist vassal states of the USSR, all agreeing to take on finalising contracts for major airframe sub-assemblies, the eventual costing for the BAC 311 coming down to a triumvirate of sources, with £84 million to be fronted by the British government, £56 million by the City Banks of London, and the remainder by BAC itself, who would also be responsible for any cost overruns, break-even for the project being set at 200 units, with a full recoup of costs being set at 240 units plus the sale of spares. Employment benefits brought about by the BAC 311 being expected to see approximately 65,890 people directly and indirectly involved in the project, while by comparison the Airbus A300 was expected to see only around 30,000 people in the UK working as part of the scheme, a request for launch aid being lodged with the Wilson government on November 25, 1969, as supported by an enthusiastic BEA and the national press. It was at this point that the BAC 311's future was cast firmly into doubt, as despite the aircraft illustrating huge leaps ahead of the Airbus A300, including a prospective sales advantage, widespread employment benefits in the UK, international collaboration across the globe, a bolstering of British national pride and industry, the recognition of the BAC company name on the wider market when compared to the largely unknown Airbus brand, a solid business case, BAC's commitment to cover cost overruns, and the reinstatement of a major aviation project that was centred in the UK rather than Europe, the Wilson government remained hesitant on the decision to provide launch aid, a move which, from outside perspectives, was done simply so as not to antagonise the French and German governments prior to the potential entry of the UK into the common market, even though the membership of Britain as part of the Airbus scheme had been questioned even as early as 1968, in which it was highlighted that the UK airliner industries, at the instigation of the ruthless Sud Aviation and the French government, was shipping en masse highly advanced technological information to Toulouse without anything of major significance being sent back in return, compounded further by Britain's withdrawal from the Airbus project in May 1969. BEA, who had long shown no interest in the A300, publicly and repeatedly declaring its support of the BAC 311 and questioning why the government was being so hesitant as to its decision to provide launch aid to a proven British project. Negotiations continued throughout the year to no avail, with the then Minister of Technology, Tony Benn, considering that the commercially lagging A300 be dropped in favour of the European Airbus project being centred around the BAC 311, a suggestion that was met with hostility by the French and German governments, who refused to take the position of junior partners to Britain in the Airbus venture. The Wilson government's excuse as to why they were hesitant to provide launch aid being that they were conducting an intensive cost-benefit assessment of the 311 so as to confirm that it was a viable prospect when compared to the A300, the deliberations as to the progress of garnering launch aid for the airliner being made worse following the ousting of Wilson's Labour government in June 1970 by the Conservative government of Edward Heath during that year's general election, meaning that all the ground covered in seeking state funding was suddenly lost, as Labour ministers were replaced by Conservative ones who had no knowledge of the BAC 311 discussions, meaning the debate had to be started from scratch, and with a government that was less open to the concept of providing taxpayer money for private industry projects. Thus, new lobbying to the government was forced to take place, but this was now in the face of increased competition from the Airbus proposal, which stated that, in order to try and woo investment from the British government, Hawker Siddeley would rejoin the Airbus consortium as a full partner and contribute between 27 and 30% of the total airframe construction. The larger Airbus A300B7 would integrate Rolls-Royce RB211 engines, and, in combination with the French, German and Dutch governments, the UK taxpayer would only have to contribute as little as £30 million into the A300 scheme thanks to the sharing of funds with its international partners, while the BAC 311 required a minimum of £144 million to bring the project to fruition. These various factors, combined with a continued eagerness by the newly elected Conservative government to join the European community, meant a strong divide between the pro-Airbus frontbench and pro-311 backbench of Parliament was brewing, BAC responding by stating that, in order to reduce the necessary production costs, cheaper pre-existing General Electric CF6 power plants could be sourced instead of the still heavily delayed RB211s, the CF6s, in practice, actually resulting in improved performance over the Rolls-Royce power units. This ongoing indecision by the government continued through until November 1970, by which time BAC was stumbling financially week to week, as uncertainty for the project's launch became a terribly real prospect. The monetary package it had originally allocated to cover the startup costs, with the expectation that state funding would come sooner than it did, almost being depleted, and was now eating away at the firm's profits. The Conservative government now establishing a macroeconomic cost-benefit analysis, in which three options as to the future of providing BEA with a new wide-body jet airliner for trunk European routes were considered. The first being the state funding of the all-British BAC 311, of which BEA had the greatest interest but carried the most expense, a commitment to invest in the Airbus A300, of which BEA had no interest but carried a lower expense, or to allow BEA the opportunity to purchase Lockheed L-1011 TriStars from the United States, which was a move, under the launch aid restrictions, the government could not publicly endorse, despite the fact that it was by far the cheapest option. While employment benefits for each of the schemes would see 60,000 employed in the UK for the BAC 311 as part of the full design, development and assembly team, 30,000 employed for the Airbus A300 at Hawker Siddeley and Rolls-Royce, and only 9,000 for the TriStar, who would solely be at Rolls-Royce, as the RB211 was the exclusive power plant for the American trijet. Ultimately, a paper published by the Ministry of Technology came to the conclusion that the BAC 311 was by far the best choice for Britain's long-term position in the civil aviation scene, the creation of a rival Airbus-style airliner in the UK, and withdrawal from the Airbus scheme itself, allowing the UK to have a stronger position in terms of being a future base for collaborative pan-European airliner projects based on the stronger business case of the 311, while at the same time having strong reservations as to the competency of Sud Aviation in being able to carry through the A300 to completion. This sentiment echoed by various ministers, including former Minister of Technology Tony Benn, the only point of concern for the BAC 311 project being its increased expense over commitments to the Airbus as a junior partner, although there were some opponents in Parliament against the British twinjet, most notably Sir Solly Zuckerman, the government's chief scientific advisor, who stated that the 311, in competition with the A300, would ultimately divide rather than unite Europe's aircraft industries, and thus make them easy pickings for the American giants, preferring instead that the UK collaborate with joint international projects, with Rolls-Royce being positioned as sole engine provider for these schemes, thus establishing the British builder as the most significant in Europe. Eventually, on November 26, 1970, Minister of Aviation Supply Frederick Caulfield presented to Parliament a final memorandum on the option for BEA's future wide-body airliner, declaring that, of the potential choices, the BAC 311 was the best option, provided that it was powered by Rolls-Royce RB211 engines, although he did concede that, should the financial situation at Rolls-Royce become desperate due to the costs and delays involved in developing the RB211, ultimately leading to its bankruptcy in February 1971, then the General Electric CF6 provided a useful fallback. But sadly, despite strong and consistent support from members within both the Labour and Conservative governments, the Cabinet had to come down one side or the other, and on December 2, 1970, Caulfield stood before the House of Commons and announced that the government would not provide funding for the BAC 311, but at the same time it would not commit to rejoining the Airbus consortium, stating that the decision to avoid both schemes was due to the financial constraints of supporting the ailing Rolls-Royce due to its tight contractual obligations to Lockheed in supplying RB211s to the TriStar, and because the ever-present Concorde, which had first taken flight in March 1969, remained a continued drain on government funds, the eventual state cost of rescuing Rolls-Royce and bringing the RB211 to fruition coming to £170 million by the time the project was completed. The response to the cancellation of the BAC 311 was generally one of overwhelming condemnation within the British Parliament and the national press, as it was considered simply a myopic short-term solution to budgetary constraints rather than taking a long-term strategic view of Britain's place on the world stage of aviation, Tony Benn stating that this was a watershed moment in the UK's airframe industry, and indeed the end of its place as a viable competitor to the likes of Europe and the United States. While from the other side of the House, Benn was blamed squarely for the fact that no money was available to support the 311 project, as it was his insistence that Rolls-Royce sign up blindly to the stringent demands of the Lockheed TriStar contract, completely underestimating the scale of the task, as well as demanding that Concorde be pushed through despite its failing commercial viability, the only enthusiasm for the collapse of the 311 scheme coming from the governments of France and Germany, who were glad to see the end of a strong competitor to the Airbus venture. Their response veiled in the statement that the removal of the 311 meant that attention could be paid on a single Airbus-style project in Europe, rather than dividing efforts and potential sales in a move that would ultimately serve to weaken the place of the European airliner industry overall. With the power of hindsight, while the BAC 311 project had a strong commercial business case, and had garnered the interest of multiple airlines across the globe thanks to BAC's effective marketing campaign, the likelihood of the airliner reaching its forecast sales goals has often been brought into question, especially when considering the cash-strapped and fickle nature of the British government, the bankruptcy of Rolls-Royce in 1971, and the slump of airliner sales caused by the onset of the 1973 oil crisis, which occurred around the time the first BAC 311 was expected to take flight, likely giving Parliament the ideal opportunity to either drop or postpone the project, the latter option meaning that the airliner, while ultimately reaching completion, would lose its commercial edge as the Airbus A300 moved in to catch up in terms of sales, the only reason the A300 was able to survive the turbulence of the oil crisis era being the dogged determination of the French government and management to maintain their prestige on the aircraft building market, and were even able to convince the German government to stay on with the project when they threatened to abandon the scheme during 1975 as commercial interest remained threadbare. In the end, the Airbus A300, amid the only sales of the type going to the French and West German flag carriers Air France and Lufthansa, was saved at the last minute thanks to an influx of orders from Far Eastern airlines who wished to make use of the twinjet on their high-density trans-Asian services, thus sparking huge interest in the fledgling builder and gaining major traction in the post-oil crisis civil aviation market, with lobbying in the United States even seeing several examples of this model be sold to carriers such as Eastern Airlines and Pan Am once the notorious 60-minute rule had been rescinded during 1978. This piece of outdated legislation being the most significant yoke around the shoulders of the A300's initial commercial viability on transatlantic routes and the American market. Continued investment by the French, German and Dutch governments, later joined by the Spanish and Italian aircraft industries, meaning the firm went from strength to strength, creating a slew of models that range from the gigantic long-haul Airbus A340 and A380 to the high-density backbone of modern-day low-cost carriers and regional airlines, such as the Airbus A319, A320 and A321. Its ability to expand rapidly, meaning it was able to not only create a viable alternative to Boeing's influence on the airliner market, but was even able to displace McDonnell Douglas as the second largest of the world's aircraft builders, leading to their eventual collapse in 1997. Back in Britain, the collapse of the BAC 311, as the last viable independently built large airliner project in Europe that wasn't involved in the Airbus scheme, set the tone for the future as startup costs, as well as pre-existing involvements in Airbus that created conflicts of interest, meant despite several new medium to large airliner concepts coming and going, such as the BAC X11 and the Dassault Mercure 200, none of these schemes went beyond the drawing board, the British aircraft industry itself now having a huge gap left in its product range that missed the vast majority of prospective buyers. The subsonic mass production short to medium range jet airliner segment, in terms of new builds, being instead flanked by Concorde at the very top of the market as a niche supersonic long-range project with a dwindling business case in the post-oil crisis era, and the humble Brito-Norman Trilander down below as a gruff utility aircraft, the only UK models serving the subsonic jet and turboprop market, being legacy projects from the 1960s including the Hawker Siddeley HS748, which sold well as a short-field turboprop airliner specially built for rough and remote airports, the BAC 111, which had seen its sales slump to a dribble by the turn of the 1970s as extended length and range variants were dropped, thus seeing it lose all its advantages to the Douglas DC-9 and Boeing 737, and the Hawker Siddeley Trident, which was originally to end production at the beginning of the decade, but was given a reprieve thanks to a sudden influx of orders from Communist China, allowing the model to remain in production until 1978. As for answering BEA's requirement for a short to medium haul airliner, of the three options as outlined by the government in 1970 so as to satisfy its needs, the first choice of the BAC 311 had been axed by the state, while the second choice of adopting the Airbus A300, even at the insistence of the government as part of their attempt to smooth over entry into the European community, was shunned due to the perceived betrayal of the state in favouring the foreign build over a homegrown equivalent, thus leaving them with no choice but to adopt their third and cheapest option of buying a contingent of Lockheed L-1011 TriStars fitted with RB-211 power plants, although due to the bankruptcy of Rolls-Royce in 1971, which delayed the TriStar project by over a year, it wouldn't be until after the merger of BEA and BOAC to form British Airways in 1974 that the Lockheed TriStar would eventually enter service with the carrier. TriStars playing a major role with British Airways on European trunk services and long-distance routes to the Middle East until 1991, while the UK government's hands-off tactic when it came to the matter of supporting the BAC 311 or the Airbus project did nothing to either embolden or antagonise the nations of Europe with regard to the entrance of Britain into the European community, which was undertaken on January 22, 1975. Subsequent to this unhappy chapter, the first new project to be released by the British aircraft industry, though in joint venture with France, was the Aerospatiale BAC Concorde, which, while starting the decade with 74 orders from carriers across the globe, including America, China, Iran and Australia, saw various internal and external factors, including the fear of damaging sonic booms, spiking fuel prices caused by the 1973 oil crisis, and the crash of the rival Tupolev Tu-144 supersonic airliner of the USSR at that year's Paris Air Show, lead to the commercial viability of the Concorde scheme be heavily reappraised by potential buyers, meaning that, by the time of the airliner's commercial introduction in January 1976, all but 4 of the original buyers were left attached to the project, British Airways and Air France through obligation to their respective governments, while CAAC of China and Iran Air maintained orders without delivery until 1979, when the Concorde project was officially axed. Concorde services originally working along various corridors to North and South America, as well as a short-lived run to Singapore via Tehran, before finally being concentrated solely on the primary transatlantic corridor from London and Paris to New York and Washington, D.C., with occasional tourist runs to the Caribbean, Northern Europe, and other ad hoc destinations. Concorde, overall, being one of the biggest commercial failures in aviation history, despite the fact that it is often considered the pinnacle of airliner technology. Beyond Concorde, the British aircraft industry would stumble on with severe job cuts and facility closures until 1978, when the Labour government of Prime Minister James Callaghan opted to nationalise the UK's largest remaining aircraft builders by merging the assets of BAC, Hawker Siddeley and Scottish Aviation to form British Aerospace or BAE, inheriting several legacy airliner models including the popular though ageing HS748, the ailing BAC 111 and the promising Jetstream regional turboprop, as well as taking on several upcoming schemes including a revised variant of the Jetstream dubbed the Jetstream 31, and the Hawker Siddeley HS-146, a long-delayed regional jet airliner scheme that would combine the low-noise power plants of a Canadair business jet with a highly optimized airframe for use on the emerging STOL or short takeoff and landing market, the 146 having originally been launched in 1972 with the help of state-funded launch aid, only for it to be axed by the government in 1974 in the wake of the oil crisis, though background work was allowed to resume throughout the remainder of the 1970s until the eventual BAE 146, as retitled following the merger, took to the skies in 1981, the first wholly built British airliner to be released since the BAC 111 18 years earlier in 1963. Through its inclusion of Hawker Siddeley, BAE also regained entry into the Airbus scheme by adopting its 20% share in the firm, and taking on the duties of being the builder's main wing designer and manufacturer, although the reality was that, had the government opted to rejoin the Airbus venture as an equal partner in exchange for the BAC 311 project in December 1970, the UK would have been allowed a far more favourable position in the European multinational builder and thereby reaped a greater degree of rewards from its exponential commercial success during the 1980s, instead being but a junior partner filling a vital role, but not having a major say in the direction of the firm at a corporate level in the same manner as Germany, France, Spain or the Netherlands, while in light of the incredible profits and low risks presented through military contracts for fighter and ballistic missile projects, BAE indicated very early on that it had little to no interest in creating dedicated commercial airliners, and would seek to exit this market once its existing slew of products started to lose their sales edge. In the meantime, the British aviation industry, during the 1980s, showed signs of a resurgence for short-haul regional aircraft designs, the BAE Jetstream selling in massive numbers across the globe as a sturdy and efficient feeder liner for some of the world's most significant carriers, even making a breakthrough into the still highly insular American market with franchisees for major US airlines such as United Airlines, Continental Airlines, Northwest and American Airlines, remaining in production until the failure of the enlarged Jetstream 41 in the mid-1990s led rapidly to BAE axing the entire range, while the Hawker Siddeley HS-748, approaching the end of its production run as its market segment was swamped by new models such as the de Havilland Dash 8 and the ATR-42, was revamped under a new scheme dubbed the Advanced Turboprop or ATP. But due to BAE placing a greater interest in its involvement in the Airbus A320 twin-engine jet airliner project, the ATP's launch date was pushed back 2 years, and funding would be provided solely by BAE itself, meaning that, upon its eventual launch at the end of the decade, it had no chance of competing strongly in a market now fully saturated by the Dash 8 and ATR-42, leading to a sales calamity. Finally, there was the BAE 146, an airliner that, ostensibly, was a huge sales success for British Aerospace as it found its way into the fleets of airlines across the globe, presenting a rugged and robust model that could fly into just about any airport in the world, while providing both passenger and cargo capacity that was ideal for high-density commuter runs, once again even finding a place among the carriers of the United States, with franchisees for Northwest Airlines, United Airlines, US Air, and Pacific Southwest, although behind the scenes, due to the 146 being a popular airliner among start-up regional carriers that had not the capital to afford buying the model outright, British Aerospace provided a lease agreement with customers, which meant that 146 were being flown, but not bought at their market price, meaning the project was always running only slightly above break-even, and nearly caused BAE's bankruptcy during the 1992 global economic recession, the 146 remaining in production under its refreshed guise of the Avro RJ thanks to its enduring popularity until 2001, where, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and subsequent airline market slump, together with the newly rebranded BAE Systems wishing to devote itself entirely to military contracts, with schemes such as the upcoming Eurofighter Typhoon, meant the Avro RJ, amid dwindling sales, was dropped in 2002 despite work being well underway to create a fully revised twin-jet design dubbed the Avro RJX, the Avro RJ being the last British-built commercial airliner, and heralding the end of the long and dismal decline of the UK's airliner industry from its commanding position in the mid-1950s to its unceremonious demise at the start of the new millennium.